So welcome everybody. This is MDC Connects 2024. I'm Sarah Brockbank from Medicine's Discovery Catapult, and I'm hosting the webinar series with my colleague David Pennington. This is the first in the series. We've got 5 weekly webinars, and they're going to run every Tuesday, 1 till 2 p.m. So each year, Medicine's Discovery Catapult have aimed to connect the community by running a short series of weekly webinars. And experts from within MDC have come together with experts from across the community, I should say, to educate and inform. And this year, we're doing something a little bit different. So in previous years, we've run a series based on the science, but this time we're going to outline the journey from innovation to commercialisation. And we've got an absolute stellar lineup of speakers. We've got funders and venture capitalists, we've got science parks and CROs, we've got patent attorneys, TTOs and pharma, who are all freely giving their expertise. We're going to start in the first session by setting out the challenges, and then we're going to focus in the subsequent sessions on securing funds, building the science, the infrastructure and the skills required, protecting intellectual property, and then finally commercialising your innovation. So for today, we're going to cover the current climate and set out the challenges. And I'd like to welcome 3 speakers, all from Medicine's Discovery Catapult today. So we've got Chris Molloy, our CEO, who's going to talk about creating a richer national R&D pipeline. Then we're followed by Tim Newton, who's a senior market analyst, and he's going to talk about decoding the therapeutics financing, the current climate. And he's got some interesting data on the finances for SMEs and spin-outs. And then finally, Nicola Heron, who's our Chief Strategy Officer, is going to help us tackle the challenges. So before I hand over to Chris, I'm just going to ask that at the end of every presentation today, there will be 2 minutes for questions. Please type your questions into the Q&A box. That's the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, not the chat box. And we will take questions at the end of the presentations. Okay, Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah, and welcome to everybody. Thank you all very much indeed for taking the time to spend with us today to look through some of the issues that the sector has, to see how it has been successful and continues to be successful in a highly challenging, high-risk sector, and where some of its barriers are today, maybe compared with where they were a few years ago, and some of the things that we can do as a nation, we can do as a catapult, we can do as each other to help each other in this community to be successful. Because we are all in the life sciences. And if you take the word science out, you are left with a very important word. And that word is life. And that is what drives most of us. And that's not just a rose-tinted, motherhood and apple pie type of approach. This is why most of us on the line today get up every morning, come to work to do things which may stand a good chance of not working. Why? Because it's patients' future that we help to make bright, and we will all be patients one day. So there's more than something in it for each of us, but more importantly, and what drives most of us, is what's in it for other people. I'm going to make some comparisons with some research that we did just pre-COVID in 2019. And try and draw some comparisons with where we are today, where the biotech sector is today, and where some of its challenges, issues, and successes may be. And I'm going to start off with the successes and say very clearly that over the last 5 years, when funding has been strong and productivity has been high, the UK drug discovery sector, preclinically and early clinically, has made the very best of this time. You will see in a minute that we have grown as a sector the national pipeline of assets preclinically and into the clinic. We have diversified those assets away from just a very small number of diseases across a broader set of conditions pulling more UK science into translation, through translation, into the clinic, and ultimately towards patients. We've done something that we weren't doing very much of about 5 to 6 years ago, which is entertaining more complex medicines. And increasingly over the last 5 years, we are doing more of that. And I think these efforts will drive the large company pipelines of the future and feed the pipelines of the future and the clinics of the future. We've used the post-COVID flush of funding, and there was a pulse of funding that went through the community, as most of you will know, through COVID times. And it's used that money well to turn this great UK science into treatments for patients. But, and there's always a but, isn't there? We've, in doing so, used up available space, available skills, and the available money. So therein lies some of the challenges which I'll cover, and my colleagues will help cover over the next hour and then the next few weeks. We all, I think, recognize today. And today started to occur, the midwinter started to occur about a year or so ago as funding started to fall away, confidence declined. And much of that was driven by the global economic situation. Our sector has performed reasonably well in comparison with many other high-tech sectors, as it generally does during an economic downturn. But we have to realize that high interest rates make it harder for high-risk venture funding to raise money themselves, and that reduced by about 90% year on year. And that led to a downstream reduction in funding of about 50% year on year towards companies in our sector. And that was even more the case in the preclinical side of our sector. And Tim will have some very sophisticated analysis of how that has panned out later on in this call. But at the same time, obviously, when it's hard to raise funds, funders have a decreased risk appetite. And that decreased risk appetite has been particularly the case in preclinical. Coupled with that, of course, increased costs. Inflation has driven increased costs in everything, whether it be for available space, for consumables, and ultimately for people who make up a great deal of the cost of doing life sciences biotech. But as I said, biotech is holding its own, relatively speaking. And there's some really good research by the BIA, which I'll come back to later on, which underpins that. But we do need to look at some of the trends in pre-seed, seed, and in across our preclinical cohort, because that's where the hammer has hit hardest. But there is a coming recovery. It's starting to happen. By no means is this in the full flush of recovery, but I do wish to give a message of confidence, a message of growth, a message of recovery, and a message of rebirth. We're starting to see funding flow again. Now, that funding may be going into either M&A or service activity in pharma services and in areas of clinical development. It is not going particularly into preclinical research, and I think we all know that. And advice from many funders has been, if you are in preclinical, try and extend your runway. Of course, there will be limits to that. Of course, there will. But the start of the sunrise is with us. You may also have seen last year the Mansion House Compact, which started to bring to us the promise of future flows of pension funding, but we must get an absorptive capacity for that if we are to make best use of it. And the spin-out review, which occurred in November of last year, which made some very sound recommendations about how we build national pipelines, taking our very best science, translating it more effectively, and delivering it towards patients and certainly towards funders. So our call to action really from today and as we go forward and across this series of talks is around how we create fit to fund companies and take those fit to fund companies towards growth so they are fit to grow and fit to receive the funds that will flow. Let's scamper then through some of our up-to-date research and compare it a little bit with where we were 4 or 5 years ago. In this graph, you will see the spread of assets in a therapeutic segmentation for SMEs in our sector. And you will note from the right-hand side here a couple of really good news stories. The number of assets flowing through this group of companies is up significantly from 2019. And also the top 3 from the analysis in 2019, and you'll see it in our MDC State of the Nation report, has declined. And what that tells us is that there is now a greater spread of therapeutic areas across the national portfolio and the national pipeline. And we see decline a little bit, relatively speaking, in oncology, and increases in things like metabolic disease and GI. And our other category remains roughly the same: cardiovascular, musculoskeletal, ophthalmology, and dermatology, where it remains more of an opportunity, let me put it that way, for the UK to start innovating, drawing in invention and driving it through in those sectors which are relatively underpopulated, but for which there is no shortage of real patient need. I also want to note, as we look at this pipeline, some of the new initiatives in some of these areas. And I look at the PACE AMR initiative that was launched by Innovate UK, LifeArc, and Medicines Discovery Catapult in October of last year. I wish to make note of the National Dementia Mission, the Dame Barbara Windsor Dementia Mission, which has been launched by the UK government. I'm thinking of the Motor Neurone Challenge that's supported both by charities and most recently in a LifeArc challenge, and the Psychiatry Consortium, which is run by the MDC for a number of years and is looking to its next round of development. And these are all working to give us more diversity in this space, more assets flowing through, more pipelines towards patients. A quick piece of data which you'll all get very, very easily, which is the split between small companies, SMEs, and large companies, which have traditionally been big pharma, but now also include some of the big data companies like Exscientia and Benevolent and others who qualify as large companies. And you'll see the split: 80% discovery in SMEs and roughly 65% of development in the larger companies. And why is that relevant? Well, for this graph and the one to follow, which is on the left-hand side, the split of those drug assets by therapeutic area, and on the right-hand side, how they are in large companies. And what is, I would position with you, a trend is, will we see in future years the split on the left-hand side, which is where the SMEs are developing new assets, where the large companies are developing those assets? And will we start to see increases, for example, in metabolic disorders in the large companies flowing from the small? Will we see increases in infectious disease, in respiratory and so on, moving from left to right across the pipelines of small to large companies? So we look at the SMEs and say, do we have a more diverse future in clinical development pipelines? And I would argue very strongly that the answer to that is yes. And in exactly the same vein, when we look at more complex types of medicines, that's split between small molecule, large molecules, targeted formulations, and so on. And you're starting to see growth on the left-hand side, which is our SMEs, of some of these more complex medicines, and a smaller proportion of them on the right-hand side in today's development-dominated larger companies. And posit that there may be this trend starting, where we're starting to see more complexity coming in through the SME community and towards the development community. And that can only be good for the diversity of applications that will move to patients. And I note on the right-hand side here a report that we did in 2021 about shaping the UK into an epicenter for more complex medicines, a broad definition, but some of these more targeted precision treatments, which will allow us to attack many more types of disease. And mRNA, which we've seen in a very post-COVID environment, is one of those types of medicines which we should both embrace and exploit to their maximum. But that is the good news, and it continues to be good news. But there is this winter that we are currently experiencing, and the funding pressures in there are extremely well covered in the recent report by the Bioindustry Association, UK Biotech Financing 2023, and I urge you all to go and read that. And what Tim will talk to you about later is a very sophisticated view looking at the seed and pre-seed and early stage preclinical companies within that cohort, and how the flexing of funding over the last few years has affected them particularly. And just to give you just a very brief entry point into that, looking over 2020, 21 and into 22, the split of SMEs across these different funding rounds, the seed funding into venture funding, sort of the Series A, into Series B, and then beyond. And we're starting to see some trends as we go through those years, which Tim will cover in more detail. But each of those companies is experiencing the winter in a slightly different way. And there's a few small number of slides here just detailing that from our current research. We're seeing the hammer blow fall more strongly in cost pressures on our seed and venture communities. To some extent, the CRO communities, and that reflects a slowdown in funding, a slowdown in decision making, a reduction in scope of services from companies trying to extend their runways. So, there's some real issues for our seed and venture companies. We've used up many of the available skills that we have in the UK in developing these increased pipelines and increased numbers of companies. And that's a good news, bad news story. Good news that we've used the skills and those skills have been deployed well. Bad news in that we need more. And unlike building buildings, it's harder to develop those skills on a very scalable basis. So we need to also see that difficulty in recruiting staff and access to those skills also differs depending on whether you are a pre-seed, seed, venture, or growth and established company. And obviously there are very good reasons for that. The confidence of skilled people to jump off a cliff and join a company with an idea and very little finance versus a company who's very well established and in growth mode. But also there are some very clear signs that we're getting around access to very specialist CRO skills, even CRO to CRO. So access to skills, access to finance are clear constraints that our community feels in different ways across the community, and that gives us cause to direct our interventions. And finally, space. Well, you've got to look quite hard for space these days, and when you find it, it's quite expensive. And that has an over expression of difficulty for our young, partially or poorly funded companies who find access to space extremely limited in certain parts of the country. And as we look across the parts of the country, and here is a download of a very recently launched, this week launched by DCIT, an innovation map, a live innovation map, which I encourage you to go and take a look at and use and browse and add to the data for, because this is all about understanding what it is that the community knows about itself. But there are areas of the country very well populated with companies in our sector. There are areas very sparsely populated, and these foci cause increases in costs, but in some cases increase in access to talent, but at a price. And all of these things contribute to the winter that our companies are facing. But we should be happy that we have a great deal of invention in this country. We should be happy that we are able to move it from invention through de-risking, through proving, towards adoption. and take all of the benefits of the very strong foundation we have of UK science in this nation. But we need to do more. If we are to drive these pipelines of invention, we must do more. And therefore, I absolutely welcome the recommendations of the spin-out review and of 11 enabling recommendations, which I urge you to go and look at, creating a transparent, visible national pipeline that will give investors in the established areas of the country and in other areas access to a critical mass of things that they can invest in is something that we absolutely should do. And to allow those companies through visibility, not just of them by us, but of us by them, to access critical support services that will help them become fit to fund and fit to grow. So as we look forward, and it is a genuine look forward to the renewal of flows of funding that may come through the release of pension funds in many years to come. It could be 2, 3, 4 years or more. We must get ready. We must, as a community, get ourselves ready to be fit to fund. We must get each other ready to be fit to fund. And we can do that in a range of different ways, harnessing, as I say, some of the recommendations of the spin-out review, but also using the existing facilities that were highlighted in last year's NERST review, catapults, incubators, accelerators, both public and private, of which the UK has a great wealth, and connect them so that we start to build a national visible pipeline with critical mass for investors across the nation, helping nurture next generation leaders, people who maybe have not been funded before, but deserve of our funding and of our time, and are the next generation fit to fund management teams. And really channel our money to those areas that you will see through Tim's analysis and others, where the 3-in-1 oil really needs to be put. And if we do that, folks, we will continue to see a sector that just not only performs, but overperforms, putting assets into an ever-growing national pipeline of diverse, more complex medicines, meeting the needs of patients, and ultimately meeting the needs of our bioeconomy. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chris, for that. Now, in the interest of time, Chris, I'm going to move straight through into Tim's talk, but you have got some questions in the Q&A. I wonder, Chris, if you could answer those online directly to the people who asked. Thank you, Tim.
Can you see my screen? Yeah. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. For the next 15 minutes, we're going to look at the financing of UK headquartered therapeutic small and medium-sized enterprises, more commonly known as SMEs. My name is Tim Newton, and as Senior Market Analyst at MDC, I'm pleased to have been asked to present to you today. At MDC, we believe therapeutic SMEs are a vital element of the drug discovery ecosystem. In my day-to-day role, I'm keenly interested in these companies, understanding their pipelines and financing. In today's session, we'll look at analysis which we conducted, examining the financing of therapeutic SMEs from the 1st of January 2020 to the 30th of June 2023. We believe our data will provide some new insights by focusing on this specific group of companies and viewing their financing based on an evolution stage, but more of this later. But before we dive into the data, let's briefly reflect on the context of the last few years and how it has shaped the current landscape. So in the past few years, we've witnessed several significant events. We've navigated through the complexities of Brexit. We've grappled with global pandemic, and we've dealt with the economic repercussions of geopolitical tensions, such as Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the current challenges in the Middle East. And these events have had a ripple effect on our economy, most notably first on inflation. Consumer Price Index, or CPI, the green line, illustrates how inflation rates began climbing in 21 and peaked in late 2022 and have been on a downward trajectory thereafter. rising prices have meant companies and individuals have had to prioritise their spending. To counteract inflation, the Bank of England made the decision to raise the base rate. And this is a critical lever in monetary policy, which has widespread effects, such as on share prices and company valuations. Now here, I've superimposed some data for venture capital funding in pharma companies worldwide from a report produced by Global Data. And the different blue boxes represent each quarter's investment. And the data goes up to Q3 2023. And I just want you to look at the overall profile of investment over time. You know, there was a noticeable increase in funding from 2019, which peaked in 2021, followed by the decline. The combination of major events, inflation and interest rates has impacted market sentiment, resulting in that decline in financing. Now, this is the global picture. And what we wanted to understand is if UK companies followed a similar trajectory. And to do this, we created a company-centric view of financing. From our day-to-day engagement with companies across the sector, we knew that different companies at different stages of their development or evolution encountered different challenges. And we wanted to get a better understanding of what was happening over this period. And we compiled a comprehensive data set that set out for each company using a mixture of publicly available and paid-for data sources. This slide highlights some of the key data sources and examples of the types of data we collected. We started the process using global data to identify UK headquartered companies with at least one active, innovative drug asset in their pipeline. This criterion ensured that our focus remained on companies driving innovation within the sector. We then identified and linked to these companies private capital transactions, public equity transactions, and grants. We then added company-related data, such as their incorporation date, location, status at a company's house, and financial data was taken from the company's annual accounts. And this could include things like turnover, the amount of cash on the balance sheet. And finally, we added deal-related data. So for the 3.5 years we were looking at, we had over 350 companies in scope, nearly 500 private capital transactions, and over 130 public equity transactions. We then took an additional important step. We asked a third party to come in and validate our data, to stress test it, to ensure its integrity and reliability. And once that had been complete, with our robust data set in hand, the next step was to see the trends it revealed and the challenges it highlighted. So we'll first start by looking at the aggregated view of financing for this group of companies. Overall, the profile is similar to what we saw from global data. Looking back at 2020, the main drivers of financing were private capital and public equity, which is almost evenly split. Fast forward to 2021, and there's a £1 billion plus leap in private capital. It's nearly 60% of all funding received in that year. 2022 brought a downturn with a significant reduction, especially in public equity. And that downward trend in financing has persisted into the first half of 2023, with financing dominated by private capital and public equity subdued. Turnover, which could be from milestone payments or providing services, has grown between 2020 and 2022. However, it's worth noting that there is a lag with turnover data, and the full picture for 2023 will not be available until later this year. Grant funding has remained fairly static and makes up a small amount of the overall financing for the sector, although it can be crucial for individual companies' survival and progression. When we look at the overall financing by year, it's important to consider the effect of inflation. The value for money has shifted in a high inflation environment, and £1 raised in 2023 is not worth as much as £1 raised in 2020. Now, these aggregate figures, although informative, conceal the realities of what realities experienced by different companies within the sector operating at different evolution stages. In recognizing this, we used our data to construct a high-level segmentation model to gain a view of how financing trends have evolved, with the aim to shed a light on the challenges faced by similar groups of companies. So let's explore these evolution stages. So we categorized each company by year into one of 4 life stages, evolution life stages. These are labeled seed, venture, growth, and established. This segmentation was done at a company level. So, for example, a seed company refers to a set of company-related characteristics and is not a particular funding deal. And for those of you who've used Bellhurst before, you may recognize these 4 evolution labels from their platform. But whereas Bellhurst applies its definitions across sectors and industries, our definitions have been customized for therapeutic SMEs. So what are the typical characteristics of companies in these 4 stages? So the seed segment makes up over half of UK therapeutic SMEs in our analysis. These companies are typically young, high-risk entities that depend on private capital and grants for survival. They may have had 1 or possibly 2 fundraisers. However, some seed companies may yet to have raised any financing. They'll have low numbers of employees, low numbers of drug assets in their pipelines, and those drug assets will be at a discovery preclinical phase. They'll have limited cash and low debt. Now, the venture segment represents about 25% of UK therapeutic SMEs, and compared with seed companies, venture organisations are typically older, have secured multiple fundraisings, and these fundraisers will be of a higher value. They'll employ more, they'll have a more developed drug pipeline, higher cash reserves, and some of these companies may access public equity. For a growth company, this represents about 10% of UK therapeutic SMEs. And compared with venture organisations, growth companies are typically older, employ more people, have raised more financing of higher value, and will have higher cash reserves. They may have licensing deals, and our indicative data indicates they have higher debt than venture companies. Finally, established companies, it's about 5% of UK therapeutic SMEs, and established companies are typically older and employ more people than growth companies. They will have had multiple fundraisers and high cash reserves. They will have multiple assets, including in the clinic, and they typically will generate revenue through licensing deals. So in summary, these high-level characteristics tend to increase as a company moves through the various stages. And having gained an appreciation of these stages, now let's go and look at the financing mix for each stage. So we'll look at the 4 evolution stages and see how they fared from 2020 to mid-2023, starting with seed and venture companies. So you'll notice the legend is at the bottom. So we have orange is grants, private capital is grey, turnover is yellow, and public equity is blue. So starting with seed, remember this is over half the companies in our analysis. Seed companies are these early stage, high-risk companies whose financing is primarily driven by private capital. And between 2020 and 2022, seed companies' private capital actually reduces year on year. And taking into account inflation, that drop is actually more significant. We also notice these companies didn't benefit from the surge in financing in 2021. And we can see the number of deals, the blue dots, has reduced each year. Fewer companies have received financing, and the average deal value has actually increased. Overall, this group of companies have had it tough, falling numbers of deals, falling amount of private capital into this group of companies while dealing with the effects of inflation. Now, venture companies, again, this represents about 25% of therapeutic SMEs. Overall, this profile reflects the view we had for the aggregated view of the segment. We see financing is driven by private capital for these companies. 85% of total financing over the period was private capital. And between 2020 and 2022, private capital for these companies doubled. We can see public equity played an emerging role through the more buoyant years in 2021, and we all see that grants and turnover do not significantly contribute to this segment's financing. So next is the growth segment. So growth companies represent about 10% of UK therapeutic SMEs. And during the period, we see a shifting landscape in both the value and mix of financing. In 2020, public equity dominated, making up more than 60% of the financing that year. Public equity then reduces dramatically over the next few years, reflecting the shift in market conditions. These companies are constrained, or in a constrained financial environment amidst inflationary pressures. And again, we have some indicative data that suggests debt for this segment has increased significantly. Then we have established companies. This segment represents about 5% of UK therapeutic SMEs. And in general, established companies are likely to depend on public equity and more recently turnover. In 2020, public equity dominated and made up more than 70% of the financing. We then have in the buoyant years that pulse that Chris talked about and the pulse of private capital coming in, which contributed significantly before falling away in 2022. As with growth companies, rising inflation, challenging accessing public equity have impacted these companies. And in this segment too, debt has increased. So in summary, in today's webinar, we've looked into the trends and challenges that shape the financing landscape from 2020 to mid-2023. We wanted to understand how UK therapeutic SMEs finance their activities in order to provide insights into the health and resilience of the sector. And we used our data set to delineate across 4 stages of company evolution: seed, venture, growth, and established. We can see that seed have been impacted by falling capital numbers of deals, which have been further eroded by inflation. Venture financing in 2022 is above that in 2020, and it's actually outpaced inflation, reflecting investors' appetite for these companies. And for growth and established, they've been impacted by the ability to raise public equity. We believe understanding these dynamics may offer new insights to help policymakers in our sector navigate towards a more robust future. Now, the resilience of therapeutic SMEs at all stages of evolution is essential for advancing drug discovery in the UK. And equipping ourselves with these insights is an important step forward. So that brings me to the end of the presentation, and thank you for your time.
Thanks, Tony. That was super. We have gone over a little bit, but despite that, I am going to ask you a question because that was super interesting. So, given your analysis and insight into the therapeutic market, what do you think will happen in 2024?
Well, firstly, I think that's a really predicting the future is always tricky. And I think, with similar to what Chris says, 2024 holds promise, but also challenges. Inflation, interest rates will undoubtedly play an important role in this. Expectations are that these will ease, but the exact timing and pace remain uncertain. And at the last Bank of England monetary policy at the end of January, I think it was sort of voted 6-3 to maintain rates at 5.25%. I think we've got geopolitical events which can affect inflation. Things like what's happening in the Red Sea around the disruptions around that, and it's how those play out. So I think, overall, we've obviously got brilliant scientists doing brilliant work. The ability to raise capital, there are signs coming through with the numbers of deals. There was a story in the FT yesterday saying that, there'd been a US biotech boom, which has ended the 2-year drought. So really positive stories coming out, especially from America. We need to see that sort of translating over to the UK. We need to see it translating over to both public equity, but also private capital going to those very early stage companies. So challenges ahead. And I think, unfortunately, we need to be realistic, and some companies might not actually survive, be able to raise the money they need in time. So I think it's going to be a year of high points and low points, really.
Super, thanks, Tim. That was really good. So if we can move through to Nick now. Nick, do you want to put your slides up? So over to Nick Heron.
Hey, thanks, Sarah. In spite of all your prepping, I forgot to get my slides up while Tim was doing his questions. So thanks, Chris and Tim. So setting out there just how fabulous the life sciences sector is, and some of the challenges we've been through and the opportunities ahead. And Tim for that deep dive into the impact on different parts of the sector, looking at our therapeutic SMEs. It's always fascinating to look at those different types of companies, understanding their journey, understanding their levels of resilience, and therefore what that might mean as to how we might support them going forward. So I'm Nicola. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at MDC, which means I've got the pleasure of working with this organisation to look to drive cross-sector collaborations to really help our innovators and ultimately make a difference to our patients ultimately. And what I'm going to talk to you about is just looking at, with the problems that we've got and what we understand to be going on within the sector, what can we do to start to tackle some of these key challenges working together? So just a bit more on the background and some context. Life sciences are a critical industry for the UK. We have ambitions and visions to be world leaders. And the 2021 Life Sciences Vision document, the government document, is still a really nice vision of how we come together to really make a difference to patients and innovation. The sector is one of growth. There's almost 7,000 businesses in this sector. It's massive. And I think what's really interesting when you think about what Tim's just said, there are about 7,000 companies within the life sciences sector, but there are about 500 therapeutic developers. And within them, 50% of them are these seed companies. So at the core of this amazing, vibrant sector is a very potent and important medicines discovery community. Chris outlined the opportunities up ahead with the Mansion House reforms, with the opportunity to unleash a significant amount of investment into our high growth companies in the UK. And of course, life sciences is part of that. And then the other point, just to reiterate, is just how complex this ecosystem is. So we've been talking about industry, large and small, but we're talking about investors, funders, government, charities, the NHS, academia, regulators, and that wider service sector. And they all contribute and work closely together. So it's a place of great opportunity, but also a place of great complexity if you don't quite know how to navigate it. Another challenge that some of our smaller companies have. So I want to just set the scene with, where did we collect this information from? What discussions have we been having? And over the last 6 months, we've done a number of different activities to engage with our sector. So we have done some surveys, we've done some interviews with large companies, small companies, CROs, charities, and we've recently held a cross-sector workshop where we looked at the key challenges that the sector's facing and brainstorm some potential solutions. So of the challenges we're facing, again, Chris pointed out these, but let's just go into them in a bit more detail. 3 big areas. So the increasing costs and difficulty accessing funding. Very clear why. We've talked about the reasons for that. Tim gave that very nicely. You fold in their grants. The competition around grants is extremely high. The quality of the grant applications is extremely high. So although there is not a reduction in grant funding, there's a perception of a reduction. And really what it is, it's just ultra competitive because the quality is so high. Companies that we are seeing hardest hit are, of course, these smaller companies who just aren't resilient, don't have the resources to be able to pick and choose and prioritise. If they've got one single asset, that's the thing they need to work on. So we are seeing that these smaller companies are hit harder. And in this environment, partnerships are really important, and we're seeing that as well. Companies show more resilience when they've got access to strong partnerships, but access to partnerships is something, again, that is not as straightforward as it possibly should be, given the breadth of the ecosystem we've got. So that's the first challenge. The next challenge we're going to look at that came out strongly was the skills shortage. We did talk to a lot of different types of organisations, and regardless of size and shape, this is an issue impacting all organisations in the life sciences sector. It impacts them differently. The types of skills they're looking for is different, but right across the board, we're seeing this as an issue. And where we are seeing it as specifically challenging is in these small companies and for our CRO companies. Our CROs accessing that specialist expertise that they require in a shortage of skills is a key challenge for them at the moment. The final area to highlight is this access to lab space, equipment and specialist services. So our companies are dependent on access to high quality labs, access to kit, and ultimately when you are small, you've got a 6-month runway of cash, it's very difficult to get the short-term access to the types of labs and capabilities that you need to be able to de-risk your asset. So we're seeing that as a significant opportunity for the future. And of course, there are great science parks, property companies that are starting to look into this, and they feature in the lectures that are coming up in our webinars. So important area of challenge, but also one that is actually gaining attention. I guess we can summarize all this through this thinking here, that our early stage SMEs are the ones that are impacted the most by the current challenges. But there's a couple of things that are really important there. They make up 50% of our therapeutic SME community. They are the vital sources of this diverse pipeline of future innovations. They're taking risks, they're working in areas that are hard, they're unmet, there isn't a lot of funding. So they are the ones that are taking a lot of risk, and they are fragile. And at the moment, with it being difficult to raise funds, funders are taking less risks. They need to see more data. The companies need access to high quality resources to develop the data. And so ultimately, we're in this vicious circle at the moment for these most vulnerable, arguably most innovative companies at the core of our sector. And what we need to be doing is thinking, how can we help these companies develop the data they need to de-risk their asset? You know, innovators want that, funders want that, the patients want that. We want to see companies get an opportunity to access high quality resources to test their hypothesis. If you're going to fail, fail because the hypothesis didn't work. Don't fail because you never got a chance to test it. That is a waste. That is an inefficient use of, as to put it simply, brilliant scientists in this country. So let's be efficient and let people fail for the right reasons. High quality resources to test your idea. So, potential solutions. We see this as a group sport, a team sport. We have to work together in collaboration to get all parts of the ecosystem lining up to support the very best ideas in order to allow us to thrive and become this global superpower in life sciences that we want to be. So the 5 key areas highlighted there. Foster partnerships with translational experts. This is about having access to the right capability, the right insight and drug discovery to really allow yourself, allow our companies to do the very best experiments in the very best way to de-risk those assets for investment. We need to find a way of providing that high quality lab and incubator spaces for companies at any stage of their life evolution. So even the very small ones, right through to a company that could afford an annual rental fee So looking into that and making sure that we can accommodate for companies at different stages of their lives right across the UK. We want to look at developing the capacity that encompasses a breadth of skills required to meet today's challenges and nurture great scientists and future leaders. So this looks at both the technical skills, the translational skills, but also those entrepreneurial and commercial skills to actually run a business. And finally, make funds available and visible. So what are the creative methodologies that we can use to blend funding, blend the interest of a number of different organisations around the UK who all want to lean in together and create environments where we can support our innovators to de-risk their assets and develop this pipeline of fit to fund companies for when hopefully the investment starts flowing again towards the end of this year, start of next year. So over the next 4 weeks, we've planned this series of webinars to address a number of these challenges that we've seen and look at potential solutions and know who's going on, who's out there, who are the experts, such that people know where to go, who to talk to. And I'll just quickly flick through this. So next week, we've got our Securing Funds, where we're going to hear from experts in grant funding, investment, private funding, and incubator support. Following that, we're going to look at building the science. So how do you get access to those high quality resources that are going to allow you to do the right experiment in the right way? We're going to look at protecting intellectual property, so identifying it, developing your strategy, and then growing your business around it. So what are the skills, the contacts, the information that's required to actually really clearly identify what you've got and take it through towards commercialisation? And then the final week, we are looking at a team of experts talking to us about this commercialisation. So what are your options? How do you work with pharma? What are pharma looking for? And some examples of successful working with pharma to take assets through. So that's all from me. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nick. It's perfect. And so I have got a couple of questions for you, actually. So the first one's, you mentioned about skills. Are there any particular skills missing? And how does that impact the companies at different stages?
Yeah, okay. So what we're seeing is at different stages. So at seed stage, what's missing is experienced drug discovery skills that seed companies find difficult to access and invite into their company. That it's a high risk venture to join, so it's difficult to attract people to want to join at that stage, and high risk. And we're seeing that companies are feeling that they're having to compete on price, which is something that's a real challenge for them at the moment in that early stage. Whereas somebody like pharma, when we speak to pharma, then it's quite specific about the types of roles. So a good example would be some of the data scientists or engineers actually in pharma at the moment. And observations are that, you know, these types of roles have always been challenging to get a hold of, especially in the last few years. But with more and more experts coming from outside of the life sciences sector into these non-lab based roles, the global demand is the challenge now. It's not just local demand, it is a global demand because people can work anywhere. And that's causing a shortage of skills in that area for pharma.
I've got another question here now. Tim actually mentioned Brexit and its impact on the economy. We've got a question here. Have skill shortages been impacted by Brexit?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, right across, right through from into universities and right through into our companies. Yes.
And then finally, just one last is, I know we will be hearing from the science parks and the CROs later in the series, as you just said, but were the issues regarding lack of space and infrastructure or skills reflected differently depending on the region in the UK?
Yes. Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's no doubt there are some real fabulous clusters within the UK, where the science parks are building, been incredibly well designed. It's called hyperaccess, knowledge corridors, ability to rent space. So there's some really great examples across the country in these clusters. But what we'd like to see is an opportunity for a great idea anywhere to thrive, rather than having to move to one of these specific clusters.
Thanks, Nick. So that brings us to the end of the 3 presentations for today. So I do just want to thank our speakers, Chris, Tim and Nick. What we've had today is very much setting the scene and setting out what the challenges are. The subsequent 4 webinars in this series will talk about how we address those challenges. And so we're starting off, as Nick has outlined, next week we will be talking about securing funds. And we're going to be joined by Samana Brannigan from Innovate, Mark Wyatt, who's an investment director at Northern Gritstone, and he'll be talking about external investment and what investors look for. And then finally, Michael Salako, who's also an investment director at Start Codon, and he's going to be talking about the importance of being pitch ready. So I think that's going to be a really useful start to our addressing the challenges. So I will see you next week on Tuesday at 1 o'clock, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Thank you. Bye-bye.